resemblance between some of the cinematic images and his original illustrations. I know, for example, the film people were so impressed by his drawing of the Tower of Isengard that they used that as the model. So that, as I say, that's just by way of background and mood setting. All right. There's one detail that I forgot to mention yesterday during my introduction. It's another little piece of trivia and also a piece of scholarliness, I suppose. Strictly speaking, none of these works are trilogies, though they're often called that. Obviously, it's self-explanatory in the case of T.H. White, where we have a 4-novel sequence, or in some editions 5 novels, if it includes the Book of Merlin as well. But the Gormenghast trilogy is so called because there are 3 Gormenghast novels in a sequence, but Mervyn Peake died in his late 50s. Rather tragically, his career and life were cut short, first by the onset of Parkinson's, about which very little was known at the time, and eventually by what seems to have been a complete neurological breakdown. But for that, we might have expected many more novels in the Gormenghast series. So if it is a trilogy, it certainly isn't by design, but if anything, by accident. There's possibly some justification for referring to the Ransom novels as the Ransom trilogy, or more often the Cosmic trilogy. Sometimes the Space trilogy, though that's a double misnomer, as we'll see in tomorrow's lecture, where Lewis upsets the whole conception of space and replaces it with the medieval one of the heavens. But there's some possibility also that Lewis would have come back and revisited that series and given us a 4th Ransom installment. The posthumous Dark Tower is a fragment that appears to continue that narrative in some ways. So I generally prefer the terms novels or series or sequence in both those cases. But as for the Lord of the Rings itself, which of course is our focus for today, it's the least like a trilogy of the lot. It's one continuous epic novel in 3 volumes. And it was published in 3 volumes because of the prohibitive costs of printing in post-war Britain. And they had no idea it was going to do as well as it did. So they were hedging their bets by insisting, as this narrative was growing out of all proportion under Tolkien's hand, that it be published in volume form. And in fact, Tolkien was quite vexed to come up with titles for each of the volumes, and he was not particularly happy with the final choices he made either. 2 Towers is a bit too ambivalent. It isn't always entirely clear which towers are being referred to. The Return of the King he disliked because it gave the ending away. But again, couldn't quite come up with anything better at the time. So it's, again, a trilogy by default. When one considers the narrative, it's very clearly continuous. The first page of 2 Towers begins right after the cliffhanger ending of Breaking of the Fellowship in Volume 1. All right. But what I really want to start with today, as I gave you some indication during question time yesterday, one of the, I suppose, unifying ideas throughout this series is going to be the whole question of how fantasy relates to the real and is grounded in something that we can recognize as real, so as to avoid an entirely disorienting or dreamlike effect. So I'm going to introduce a series of terms. Critics have used various terms to try and categorize subtypes of fantasy. We were talking at the same time yesterday about subgenres of the fantastic. Science fiction, where it shades into fantasy, could be science fantasy, speculative fiction, and so on. But critics have used a variety of further terms, and I'm going to be borrowing some from the critic Farah Mendelssohn in her study, The Rhetorics of Fantasy. Her terms are quite useful. All right. So to apply her terminology to The Lord of the Rings, that is clearly an example, many people would say the defining example, of what she calls immersive fantasy. Right? That's a very apt label. Obviously, there's a fantasy world in which the reader is totally immersed. But the idea of this as well is that we're dealing with a single, self-contained reality. There is no clear disjuncture between different realities or different planes of existence, as we have in some of the other types, which we'll move on to for comparative purposes in a moment. But with immersive fantasy, everything is contained in the fictional world, which is assumed as being real in its own right and operating according to laws which are internally consistent within that world, whether they differ from or cohere with the laws of nature that we're accustomed to or not. So the idea is, when you're reading this kind of fantasy, you can suspend disbelief easily, because, you know, although these kinds of things don't happen in our own experience, they're perfectly natural and at home in a world of this imagined type. All right, so that is immersive fantasy in a nutshell. We can contrast it most directly with what is called portal fantasy, for the obvious reason that it involves passing through a portal into the other world. So, of course, Narnia's wardrobe, Alice's rabbit hole and looking glass, or the tornado that whirls Dorothy off to Oz are all familiar examples of this kind of portal device. All right. Something whereby the characters and the reader along with them are conveyed from an entirely realistic, familiar world to somewhere else entirely. All right. So this can be seen also as a modern descendant, in a way, of another very ancient trope or motif found in folklore. Notably in Celtic mythology, for instance, where it occurs in the form of the fairy ring. If you have the misfortune to step through the fairy ring, you can be spirited away, and goodness knows if you'll ever be seen again. All right. So there are all sorts of old myths and legends that follow this pattern as well. Travellers' tales of Shangri-La and places like this, which seem to be located in a reality totally independent of our own laws of time and space. All right? Lewis is drawing on this, of course, in the theme of the time difference between our world and Narnia, so that no time passes here despite long periods passing on the other side of the wardrobe. All right? So portal fantasy, quite distinct from the immersive type of fantasy that The Lord of the Rings embodies. All right. Closely related to portal fantasy, and in some ways one can think of it as a mirror image of this, is what Mendelssohn calls intrusive fantasy. All right. This is where the setting remains the recognizable, real, everyday world. But what happens there is something or someone appears at some stage who doesn't fit, who is perhaps broken through from another realm somewhere else. So you can see it's the portal fantasy format in inversion. All right. If I'm pressed for examples, I would think that horror stories perhaps conform to this type of thing. You know, somebody like Dracula is living in our world in Transylvania, but he's clearly a creature of the beyond. All right. In a totally different format, I think the popular cultural figure of the superhero conforms to this type as well. You know? This is why he typically wears a mask and uses an alias and hides among his fellow citizens, but has this secret other identity when he's really a being of another type, whether through being an alien like Superman or having a radioactive spider bite and so on. Right? So this is a modern manifestation of the same kind of pattern there. Yeah? And then finally we have the liminal fantasy, so-called because of the borderline status it has, all right, where there's sufficient ambiguity to confuse us as to whether we're really dealing with a fantasy or not, or what the exact relations of fantastic and real are. And I suggested already that when we get to Gormenghast, that's perhaps a good example of what we're talking about here. There isn't anything clearly identifiable as impossible or supernatural or magical per se. It just feels strange. All right, so they are clearly a set of very helpful terms and concepts that we can apply. But I'm going to suggest now that they are only helpful up to a point. All right. Because when we put it to the test, something interesting happens. Classifying The Lord of the Rings, for example, as immersive works only as long as we see Middle-earth as an alternative reality. Now, it's fair to say most readers do this, and so do most critics. But not everyone agrees. I don't, and neither did Tolkien, so I'm in good company. And I hope to make my case. At this point, I should warn you, some of what I say will overlap with material that I covered in the lecture last year. I have tried to repackage things so that it isn't too repetitive for those of you who were present at that lecture. All right. The clue there was also in the title. If you recall, that was Tolkien's Truth, the Surprising Reality of Fantasy. So you can see that those ideas are still occupying me, but I have tried to recontextualize them for the purposes of this series. All right. But one of the points I made, in fact, really my opening point in that lecture, was that Middle-earth is simply an old name for our own world. So that Tolkien's choice of the name, although it might sound strange to most modern readers, is actually chosen to emphasize the reality of the setting rather than the reverse. Tolkien is working in this tradition. There are many traditional fairy stories that have references in them to Middle-earth, clearly intending our primary world through that reference. It goes back to the Old English Midangarda, which is cognate with the Old Norse Midgard from Norse mythology, which is, again, the realm of men between the various other worlds of gods and other beings. So Middle-earth is here and now, and it just looks a bit different because it's so long ago. But in fact, the text is full of details, the seasons of the year, the constellations, and so on, which clearly are identical with our own in the Northern Hemisphere, of course, and sometimes given elvish names, but nonetheless, it's very clear that Tolkien is thinking of Middle-earth as our world and not another. All right. I just want to take a moment there. There are other ways in which he reinforces this sense of reality that are perhaps worth mentioning before we move on. The emphasis on ordinariness is something that I spoke about in detail last year as well. And I gave innumerable examples, but I just want to give a quick summary of this today. But I talked about the way that the fantastic or supernatural element in the story is, by and large, sidelined. It's reserved. It's dealt with quite sparingly. It's often reserved for climactic scenes or scenes of particular significance, like Gandalf's last stand on the bridge of Khazad-dûm. But these scenes stand out. By far the majority of the text is occupied with much simpler things, primarily walking, food, especially where the Hobbit chapters are concerned, always wondering where the next meal is coming from, singing songs, telling stories, more walking, conversations about all of these things. There's a great deal of restraint in the way that Tolkien employs the supernatural within the fantasy universe. It doesn't happen all the time on every page. It's very, very sparing treatment. All right. But the primary device that Tolkien uses for connecting Middle-earth to the reader's reality is this distancing effect of time. All right. This is supposed to be an account of what the world was like countless centuries before the beginning of recorded history. He's creating this elaborate fiction that he is not making it up, but he has rediscovered lost tales. In fact, as we hinted yesterday, he is recreating these tales out of hints and fragments from the old manuscripts that were part of his professional acumen, his day job, so to speak. So this also accounts, of course, for frequent hints in the story that this mythical world is already beginning to fade, to pass away, to vanish. This accounts for much of the melancholy undertone in the story. The elves are passing away across the sea, the Ents are dying out, these various magical creatures are disappearing, and we're preparing for the fourth age, the Age of Men. So Tolkien is suggesting, of course, that this legendary reality is going to segue seamlessly into the historical reality that we now know. Now, of course, it's an obvious pretense. He doesn't want us to entertain seriously the idea that our world was really as he described it once long ago, but he does, I think, want to present it as a plausible alternative. Right. It is meant to feel natural and acceptable. Right. Another side effect of this takes us back to what I said was inadequate about the term immersive, all right? I'm not discarding the term altogether. It is very obviously helpful in characterizing this type of imagined world, which is totally self-contained. But the assumption of that definition is that the other world is totally other. And I'm suggesting, well, in fact, there is, however tenuous, however stretched out through these imagined vast spaces of time above all, that there is continuity between our reality and Tolkien's on many levels. And I think this results in a reading experience that is not simply immersive, that label doesn't do full justice to the complexity of what's happening in the novel. The sense of one layer of reality shading into another. This attempt to categorize the text also, I think, helps provide a better account for the powerful sense of familiarity that so many readers have in Tolkien's world. It is entirely believable, and I think that is largely because so much of it is concerned with the experience of being in the world, enjoying the simple pleasures of life, rather than always proceeding from one casting spell or slaying dragon episode. All right, it's much more restrained and nuanced than that. In addition to this, one can also see, surprisingly, that there are elements of portal fantasy in The Lord of the Rings as well. All right, albeit these are so subtly managed as to easily escape our attention. All right. As I mentioned earlier, this type of fantasy can be seen to derive from traditions about fairy rings and so forth. And this is very similar to what we see happening when the company ventures into elvish territory, as they do from time to time, and most notably in the Lothlorien episode, which is, of course, described as the heart of elvendom on earth. We don't notice, not straight away at least, that anything unusual has happened. Lorien certainly seems to be in the same world as everything else in the story, all right, such that its position can be clearly identified on the map, all right? But increasing attention shows that we've actually passed into a deeply enchanted region of the world, all right, where this magical quality of elvishness is somehow present in the land itself. I think it's Sam who first draws attention to this impression that he has of the place, so that it has a quality of a realm distinctively unhuman, otherworldly. It's a kind of earthly paradise. Nothing seems to die there. And the characters themselves come to feel as if they've somehow passed outside of time as it's normally experienced. Sam is surprised afterwards to observe the moon and notice that either no time at all has passed or a complete month, and he can't quite square that with his experience. So you have here an extremely subtle echo of the experience of passing into the fairy realm, but it's muted. It's only an impression that characters have. So again, even the transition in and out of fairyland is presented relatively realistically. The overall impression that's created is that reality in general is not simple but complex, that there may in fact be different layers of reality, and that the one that we call reality, the one that we normally inhabit, is somehow situated only very near the surface of our experience, all right? It reminds you of that resonant line of Hamlet's to his friend Horatio, and he says, "There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy." All right. This is very far from the merely fanciful or whimsical impression that perhaps less developed examples of fantasy can produce. All right. The Lord of the Rings is perhaps better described as metaphysical, perhaps even mystical. The final point that I made in my lecture last year is that God is a character in The Lord of the Rings, despite the fact that he's never named, never mentioned, barely hinted at, but is nonetheless hidden somewhere behind everything else. There is this invisible shaping purpose that manages to turn evil to good, and so on. All right. Tolkien, like his fellow fantasist Lewis, was, of course, a Christian writer, and he said that The Lord of the Rings was, I think it was a deeply Catholic work. He was a devout Catholic all his life. All right. And that might seem a strange thing to say about The Lord of the Rings. It might not make that impression very obviously on readers, but it is, as I say, hidden in the details. All right. This is actually just one example, and this is one of the things that I've discovered more and more in reflecting on the subject this last year. One example of a subtlety that is pervasive in The Lord of the Rings. I can't really think of many other writers, if any, who go to such lengths as Tolkien does to avoid telling us what's really going on. It's quite remarkable the extent to which he does this. I've been reading this text now for 30 years at least, and I still keep finding things that I never noticed before. There are many, many examples of this. One of my most recent discoveries, it's the scene towards the end of the Battle of Helm's Deep. The defenders have been holding out all through the night. Aragorn is principally leading the defense, and he's waiting hopefully for the sun to rise. And he's standing on the battlements looking out. And as the dawn is approaching at one point, he holds up his hand to parley with the besiegers. And they ask him what he wants, and he says, "I looked out to see the dawn. Dawn is ever the hope of men." And then he becomes a bit more threatening. He says, "Depart, or not one of you will be spared." He says, "None knows what the new day will bring." And when you first read this, you think, what on earth is he up to here? What does he know that we don't know? Or is this just one of those scenes where sort of Aragorn's ancient royal lineage comes out of him, and he ceases to be a merely ordinary warrior for a moment, but becomes almost a supernatural figure himself, a bit like the moment earlier when Legolas imagines with his sort of enhanced elvish vision that there is a crown already visible on his temples, even though this is long before the enemy is defeated and the kingdom restored. Right. So is it a moment like that? What is going on here exactly? And the text doesn't tell us straight away. In fact, it hardly tells us at all. But what happens after that, of course, is that the sun does rise and the reinforcements arrive, led by Gandalf, and the besieged are making a last heroic charge of their own anyway. And then, of course, what really saves them is that this forest has miraculously appeared. And that's what really finishes the enemy off. But we're not told that till the very end of the chapter, I think. In between, there's another detail. It's something about the enemy themselves growing dismayed, and strange tidings in the dawn, and there's this rumour spreading through them, and they're growing afraid. All right. what it took me all those years to realise, because it's not stated, is that they've seen the trees before they're even mentioned. That's what's happening. That's why they're afraid and running away. And that, it seems, is what Aragorn saw before they did. Because, of course, he would have been in an advantageous position from the battlements, looking out over their heads. He would have seen it first. But it's the roundabout way that this is told that is so distinctive. And again, one finds examples of this kind of storytelling. Another is, I'll just briefly mention this, the fact that Gandalf is one of the keepers of the 3 rings, of the elven rings in the rhyme. But it's never mentioned in the main narrative itself. There's a brief reference to it in one of the appendices. All right. So you would think something as important as that would deserve mention at some stage, especially considering, the long chapter right at the beginning, the shadow of the past. Gandalf tells Frodo the whole story of the ring and how it came to him, and that there were many rings made, and there are references to the 3 rings later on, but everybody keeps saying it is forbidden to speak of them. Well, Tolkien took that really seriously, because he doesn't tell you all along Gandalf has one. So all sorts of little details like that. But I think the ultimate example of this is the way that God himself is lurking somewhere inside the story. Quite fascinating. All right. The religious question is also an important one, I think, in terms of our overall analysis of how fantasy and the real relate. Because where we're dealing with a writer like Tolkien, whose view of primary reality not only allows room for the supernatural, but is fundamentally predicated upon it, matters become considerably more complicated. All right? His private mythology, which underpins the whole narrative of both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and is much more fully set out in the narrative of the Silmarillion, is fully congruent with Christian mythology, and that Tolkien recognised, regarded, and indeed described as the true myth. In fact, that was the hook by which he and their fellow Inkling Hugo Dyson managed to entrap Lewis into converting to Christianity from atheism. As Lewis himself recounts in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, Tolkien explains to Lewis his theory of Christianity as a myth, like other myths, but one that had become actualized in historical reality. And Lewis thought this was such a profound and original way of looking at Christianity that he was never the same again. Right. When one compares the two, of course, it's very interesting how Lewis's religion is so much more obvious in the narrative, such that the reader who doesn't perhaps share all his convictions feels a bit put upon in passages. One never has that experience with Tolkien. All right? One is almost made religious without knowing it while reading Tolkien. I'm going to end with an example of that happening. But first, I want to suggest that further light is thrown on all this by a consideration of Joseph Campbell's well-known concept of the monomyth and the hero's journey, especially in his well-known book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. Campbell writes about the way that thousands of examples of stories from every human culture there's ever been can be seen to reveal this archetypal pattern underneath. All right. All of the fairy stories, wherever they come from, they start in obscurity, with an obscure hero in an obscure village somewhere, yeah? And they proceed then through various tests and trials after you have it's the call to adventure. Right? In The Lord of the Rings, of course, that's the moment when Gandalf reveals the truth to Frodo and he has no choice but to respond to the call to adventure. Right? That's where the story really starts in all of these cases. All right? You then proceed through all the tests and trials to what Campbell calls the crossing of the threshold, which then takes you into the other world. This is the realm where the hero slays the monster or marries the princess or is reconciled with his father or finds the numinous object, any number of variations on that theme. And then we come full circle. He returns back to the world he came from, bearing the great boon of salvation that he has won for the world through the sacrifice or the deed or the quest that he has achieved. This is useful because it cuts across those differences between whether we're dealing with immersive or portal fantasy. Or one can also find versions of this quest archetype in wholly realistic fiction. All right. But I won't look at any of those now. Let's stick to the fantastic. All right. If we take the examples of Bag End in both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and say Professor Kirk's country house, where Lucy finds the wardrobe, all right, as two defining examples of the immersive and portal types, all right, they're both equally realistic in a way. They're both fictional versions of Oxfordshire. Yeah? Tolkien mapped the Shire very much on the countryside that he lived in. All right. The wardrobe adventure begins in England, in the primary world, the primary reality. All right. So in one case, the transition between the worlds is sudden and miraculous. In the other, the immersive fantasy, it's gradual and believable, so it doesn't seem to be a transition at all. But both ultimately result in encounters with the transcendent. And always, regardless of the type being employed, the reader begins in a comfortable, familiar surrounding and then progresses towards something deeper, something more mysterious, but perhaps not less real. Indeed, it's often implied that the opposite is true, that what you're journeying to is somehow more real, or that it is taking us deeper into the heart of reality through the mystery. All right. More illuminating still, in my view, than applying Joseph Campbell, is turning to his great predecessor in the field of myth criticism, Northrop Frye, whose major critical work, The Anatomy of Criticism, came out in the same year as the first volume of Lord of the Rings, 1954. I'm going to do something rare. I'm going to read a fairly substantial part of Tom Shippey's book that I mentioned to you yesterday, Tolkien, Author of the Century, because what he does so usefully is he contextualizes one of Frye's categories of types of literature ranged in a kind of hierarchy, and he applies them to The Lord of the Rings to point out how, in Tolkien's case, the rules don't apply in an obvious way. And this will also, as you'll see, fit the general theme of today, and indeed of this week. All right, just get the reference for you here. Yeah. In Fry's view, this is Tom Shippey. In Fry's view, there are 5 very general literary modes, defined only by the nature of their characters. At the top is myth. If the characters in a work are superior in kind both to other men and to the environment of other men, Fry declares, then the hero is a divine being and the story about him will be a myth. Very straightforward. One level down is romance. Here the characters are superior only in degree, not kind, to other men and again to their environment. The Fairy Queen would fit that, full of marvels and heroes who are not gods because they're human, but often godlike in their attributes. All right. The next level down is high mimesis, the level characteristic of tragedy or epic, where the heroes and heroines are superior in degree to other men, but not to their natural environment. All right. One thinks of great Shakespearean heroes, for example. They are more or less recognizable as ordinary human beings, but they're nobler. They certainly speak better. Next to bottom is low mimesis, the level of the classical novel of Jane Austen or Henry James, where the characters are very much on a level with ourselves in abilities, though maybe not in social class. Below that comes irony, where we see ourselves looking down on people weaker or more ignorant than ourselves, where heroes turn into anti-heroes and are often treated comically. So that's a very neat summary of Fry's modes, all right? And then not to linger too much, I will just sum up what he goes on to show, is that in the case of The Lord of the Rings, you have all 5 at once. Yeah? You have wholly supernatural beings at one end of the spectrum, the Dark Lord himself, the wizards who turn out to be incarnate angels. The Dark Lord himself is a fallen angel. As I said, Tolkien's mythology is congruent with the Christian one. All right. So these are figures of myth, clearly. Shippey says, if you look at Aragorn, there is a figure of romance, a human being, but as we saw in that earlier example, with touches of the supernatural about him. He can command the army of the dead, for example. All right. But most of the human characters, if we're talking about the big people, all right, I think hobbits are human too. In fact, I think hobbits are especially human. But characters like Boromir or Theoden and so on, these are like the figures of high mimesis, all right? They are noble warriors, but there's nothing supernatural about them. Hobbits are very much figures of low mimesis. I think most readers would relate more easily to hobbits than any other characters. And at the bottom of the scale we have poor old Gollum, who is certainly a figure of irony, though very deep pathos as well. Right. So very interesting insight of Shippey's, seeing that all of these modes of literature are combined in The Lord of the Rings. And now what we notice at this stage is that this scale of modes actually parallels our realism fantasy continuum quite neatly, all right? So that you can see immediately that myth is concerned entirely with beings and happenings that do not appear in our everyday reality, all right, our everyday experience. I use appear rather than exist deliberately, all right, unless you're a strict materialist for whom there wouldn't be a difference, all right. I'm sitting on the fence. I'm siding with Hamlet and agreeing there are more things in heaven and earth. Who can say? All right. But these things, whether they exist somewhere else or not, they certainly don't appear in everyday experience. All right, so myth is entirely concerned with that, entirely fantastic in nature. All right, you go down to romance, you can see it's also not entirely but predominantly concerned with the supernatural, the unknowable. All right. High mimesis is transitional between the two. The setting is the real world, but the supernatural may indeed put in an appearance, as it often does in Shakespearean tragedy. Right. Although often with an element of ambiguity, even there. Does the ghost really appear to Hamlet, or is it a sign that he's going mad already? All right. With low mimesis and irony, we're normally firmly in the realm of the real. So it maps out very nicely there. And so a text like The Lord of the Rings presents reality in general as something fluid. And surely this is a more complex and elegant conception of the world than the one implied in those dismissive characterizations of fantasy as a fairy tale for grown-ups. All right? There's surely something much deeper at work than that. All right. And a further interesting detail that I'd like to add, I'm eating a little bit into question time, so I'll be brief now, is that this fantasy realism dichotomy is actually referenced in the text itself. Right? I remember yesterday I used the example of Sam and Frodo talking about possibly being in a story one day themselves. But in fact, there's lots about stories in the story, and in fact there are quite a few examples of characters dismissing things as being merely the stuff of story. Of fairy story, it's implied, all right? The hobbits, who are not like fairy story creatures at all, despite their short size and furry feet, they feel very human, all right? They're the first to do this. Ted Sandyman, sharing a drink with Sam in the Green Dragon at the start of the story, is completely dismissive of Sam's view that you know, the elves are leaving Middle-earth and somebody saw a giant tree man, and lots of perceptive readers have wondered whether the tree man could be an Ent, or possibly even an Ent wife. But this example is just thrown up as a pretext for Sandyman to dismiss it. He says, I can hear children's stories and fireside tales at home if I want to. He's clearly too practical to go in for that. An ironic twist is much later, Merry and Pippin find that hobbits are themselves regarded as creatures of fairy tale in Rohan. Where Theoden is surprised to meet them and describe that what he calls the Holbitla. And Tolkien creates this kind of inventive etymology for hobbit from the Old English for hole builder, Holbitla. That these creatures really exist and he's meeting them. So Tolkien is in fact playing with that idea within the story itself, which is a nice touch, I think. But I promised I would end with a memorable example of the numinous breaking through into the story. I seem to recall that I probably ended with this last year as well, so I hope it's not too repetitive, but it's so good as to justify itself, of course. Shippey draws attention to this passage, but he doesn't quote it in full, and I want to end by reading the whole thing. It isn't very long. It is a speech given to, of all things, the eagle. That is one of the clearly heightened moments of the supernatural in the text. The eagles don't generally talk, unlike the Hobbit, which is more fanciful. The only other occasions where the eagles talk is to Gandalf, and the reader can assume, well, Gandalf is a wizard, you know, of course he can talk the eagle's own language, but we don't generally hear the eagles talking. So this is a very heightened moment, and as you'll notice, it's a distinctly religious moment. Shippey points out that the eagle is in fact using the language of the Psalms. It's almost identical. Some lines are identical with some of the Psalms. And what is happening is the eagle has flown to the city of Gondor to announce to the people there that the enemy is defeated. And he does it in this heightened biblical language. And the result is that there is this uncanny double meaning running through the whole thing. In the context of Tolkien's story, it's immediately obvious what the eagle is referring to. But it's impossible for any reader with any awareness of Christian tradition not to notice the other meaning lying under it as well, and to get a case of the chills. I feel them coming on even in anticipation. Right. Sing now, ye people of the Tower of Arnor, for the realm of Sauron is ended forever, and the dark tower is thrown down. Sing and rejoice, ye people of the Tower of Guard, for your watch hath not been in vain, and the black gate is broken, and your king hath passed through, and he is victorious. Sing and be glad, all ye children of the west, for your king shall come again, and he shall dwell among you all the days of your life. And the tree that was withered shall be renewed, and he shall plant it in the high places, and the city shall be blessed. Sing, all ye people. And the people sang in all the ways of the city. There. That's something more than just a fairy tale, isn't it? All right, that's all I have time for today, but there is still, of course, a window of opportunity for questions, which I'll be happy to take. Thank you. Now. If you're not tired out.
At my age, you may repeat anything 1,000 times and it will still sound like me.
Okay, thank you. I won't assume that's true for everybody.
That's why I said from you.
You're feeling that there's God at places to call God, but that feeling of God, in fact, is Tolkien. Because Tolkien is the creator, he's created the whole thing. Tolkien, in these circumstances, is God.
Yes, you're absolutely right in a sense. Tolkien, like any author, I suppose, is the god of his particular created world. Tolkien, being as devout as he was, would have shuddered at you putting it quite as bluntly as that. What he, in fact, said of this was that he was a sub-creator. He was involved in sub-creation, the creation of a secondary reality, and he felt that that was a natural thing because we are made in God's image. We are images of our own creator, therefore it is natural for us to be creators too. But he was very humble with it. He saw that reality as a step down from the primary reality. But yes, of course, part of what he's done is he has created this world with this subtly invisible power at work within it, as he believed was the case in the primary reality as well. So he's reflecting that in his world. It is meant to be, in many ways, the mirror of the world as Tolkien believed it to be. Thank you. Yes, you were first.
The long gap between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and how the whole thing grew in complexity. Did he require a lot of assistance from an editor to get it into publishable form?
That's something I don't know much details about. You can read up on it if you want to. The best place to go to is is Christopher Tolkien's many, many volumes of his father's drafts and the history of composition and how it took shape. My guess, I stand to be corrected, I would say no, he didn't. He did most of the drafting and redrafting himself. Of course, there would have been a lot of coming and going between him and his editor, Rainer Unwin. But they were pleased in the main with what he was doing. They were just frustrated that it was taking so long. There was a question here, I think, a moment ago. I'll be right there. Yeah.
Well, I suppose it's really just how consciously did he write as a sort of religious teaching kind of way? I mean, was it a conscious thing? I mean, that he wanted to do that to sort of bring hope, you know?
Certainly he would have wanted to, at a very deep level, he would have wanted to reflect what he saw as the truth. But I would say in another way, no, it wasn't a conscious process, and those drafts I was referring to are a testament to this. You can see in the writing process, Tolkien was trying to unearth something inside him. It's very interesting how the Lord of the Rings developed. He didn't have a plan. He knew the essential plot. He knew that the ring would have to be destroyed, and he knew the twist at the end, that it would only be through Gollum biting Frodo's finger off. That is, of course, the climactic intervention of Providence, because Frodo has shown mercy to his enemy all the way through. He is shown mercy in the end. There is the Christian moral worked into the story. He saw that. He saw the ending, but he didn't see all the stuff in between. In fact, he makes the point, I think this is one of the letters, that at the stage where Sam, being the most charmingly ignorant of the Hobbit characters, mistakes one of the mountains of Moria for the mountain, he says that for all he knew when he was writing it, that could have been the case. So he was discovering things all the time as his imagination threw up ideas and images. And he did sort of partly answering your earlier question now as well, he did make a number of changes and revisions in the process. For example, the original drafts, before he discovered Strider and wondered who he was, he knew that the hobbits, being so innocent and feckless, would need a more experienced guide. But his first attempt at this was an unusually adventurous hobbit called Trotter, who wore wooden shoes, hence his nickname. And I mean, that wouldn't have worked at all right? But that shows he was grasping towards something, and he wasn't working to a plan, but finding his way tentatively. Yes?
Didn't he meet regularly with a group of friends to whom he read a large draft? One of them was C.S. Lewis.
Yes.
They would have given him or commented on the work as he was writing.
You're absolutely right. That's very helpful. They were the Inklings, of course, was their nickname. Tolkien and Lewis are its two best-known members. They used to meet quite informally, twice a week usually, once in Lewis's rooms at Magdalen College, and once at the Bird and Baby, as they called it, a pub, which is actually the Eagle and Child. And if you go there today, there in one of the corners, they have a plaque on the wall with a picture of them all together, I think. That they used to meet, and they would read work in progress to one another. And they were quite forthright in their criticisms of one another as well, as the ale flowed and the pipe weed was smoked. They didn't let each other off easily.
So the purpose was actually a sort of an informal writing group.
It was very much an informal writing group.
An academic group that happened to have the writing as a sideline.
Yes, yes. Academics and creative writers letting off steam, sharing ideas together. This will lead us neatly into the continuation tomorrow, where we'll start with some general comparisons of Tolkien and Lewis. One of the interesting contrasts between them is Tolkien complains that Lewis was too susceptible to influences. He was always sort of blowing with the wind as far as Tolkien could see, and trying out new ideas all the time. And Lewis had the opposite complaint of Tolkien, that he was uninfluenceable, that you couldn't change his mind at all, that he was just bent on what he wanted to do, and you couldn't, he was just resistant to criticism.